How's that? Is that better? No?
Okay, let me just, can I try?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
It's hard without a mirror.
Yeah.
Time to tie.
Just on the notes.
Okay, try that.
Does that work? Better? Great.
All right. Okay, is mine still working?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right. I think we're ready to start. Welcome to Night Owls. There we go. And I'm your host, Agnes Kellard. No, I am not Agnes. So let me go over the game plan here. So we'll chat for about 40 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. Then we'll break for cookies for about 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to everyone. So that's the plan. So I'll start. I am not Agnes. My name is Daniel Holz. I'm a professor in physics and astronomy and astrophysics. I work mostly on black holes and gravitational waves. I also am chair of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. That's the organization that sets the doomsday clock. I should mention that next Tuesday, we are announcing the latest time of the doomsday clock, so stay tuned for that. And I'm also teaching a class called Are We Doomed right now with James Evans, who's here. And David gave a great lecture in the class today. And I'm also involved in a new effort called the Existential Risk Laboratory here on campus, where we're, kind of developing a community focused on existential risk. Okay, so that's me, and in Night Owls fashion, I'm going to let David introduce himself.
Hey everybody, I'm David Wallace-Wells. I'm like a world-famous climate alarmist. I'm mainly a journalist. I wrote a book a couple years ago called The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, and have done a lot of work around like worst-case scenarios for climate change and thinking about what it's going to be like to live on a planet that's really transformed by the force of warming. I came to that subject kind of strangely. I often start off presentations and lectures by saying, I'm not an environmentalist by nature. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. I've literally never gone camping in my life. I'm not somebody who enjoys the natural world except through a window or whatever. But about 5 or 6 years ago, as just a general interest journalist, I started seeing a lot of academic research about what climate change had in store for us. Thought it was really scary. Thought it added up to a much bigger story, much more all-encompassing story than really was being told in public by almost anyone, and wrote a magazine article on that basis that generated a huge response and drew me into this, what is still today, kind of an uncomfortable role as a climate figure. And I've been trying to think about that, think about what it means for all of us, but also what it means for me kind of ever since. So I'm really glad to be here talking about all of that, life after climate change, how to think about it, how to think about the doomsday clock, how to think about existential risk, and with all of you in particular. I actually spent a year as an undergraduate here at Chicago, so I feel also like a very sweet homecoming and a little bit like I'm actually 19 years old again right now. So yeah, be kind.
All right. Okay, so I think we'll dive right in, and that's probably a great place to start. So you are kind of probably most well known for being a climate doomer or alarmist, but over the last few years, that narrative has shifted a little bit. It's your article Beyond Catastrophe, and there's just this general sense, I think, in the community that maybe things aren't quite as bad as we thought they were. The price of renewables has dropped. The political kind of landscape seems to be shifting. The worst case models seem to be getting better, or at least narrowing. So So it seems like your narrative has kind of shifted to something more positive. That being said, the last year was the hottest, on record by a lot. We're still up to our ears in climate disasters. CO2 is still being emitted like crazy. So where are you now? Where are we in this?
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about the state of our understanding of climate change, I always think it's useful to say almost all of how you feel about this is going to be a reflection of where you're coming from and where you've been on climate before. So if you're waking up to climate change right now and thinking, oh my God, things seem to be changing and getting worse, how much worse are they going to get? The answer is still a lot worse. Where we have a lot more warming in the system, it's going to be a lot more disruptive, there's a lot more human suffering than we've seen to this point, and I think very few people on the planet have managed to wrap their heads around that scale of disruption and suffering. But I am coming to the question of where we are now from a place of real alarm, thinking a few years ago that we were heading for not just more warming than we've had to this point, but something like 4 times as much warming as we've had to this point. And I thought that because most conventional models of our climate future described that future as a business as usual path, that we would not be at 1.2 degrees of warming as we are today, not at 2 degrees as we may hope to be at the end of the century, but something like 4 or 5 degrees. And the science that came associated with that warming scenario was really, really quite grim. I mean, we're talking about a doubling of global conflict at every level. We're talking about global economic impacts that could be as large as 20 or 30%, cutting 20 or 30% off of global GDP by the end of the century. It's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. We're talking about large-scale agricultural declines after a century or so in which we've had very, very steady inclines of agricultural yields.
Sorry, is this Fahrenheit or Celsius?
Celsius. And that's all at 4 and 5 degrees, where there are a lot of climate scientists. I don't myself, I think, agree, but a lot of climate scientists would say if we get to that level of warming, the future of civilization is in doubt. And maybe even some feedback loops could be brought into play that could bring the future of the human race into doubt at that level of warming. But now, that level of warming is no longer a business as usual future. Very few people talk about it that way. And there are a number of reasons for that. There's been a global political awakening, especially over the last 5 years. The price of renewables dropping, as you say. Some revisions to our modeling of energy expectations. Like we used to think the whole developing world was going to go the Chinese route and basically develop through coal power. Now that seems unlikely. And for all of these reasons, we've gone from thinking something like 4.5 degrees of warming is business as usual to thinking like something like 2.5 degrees this century is business as usual. And so if you're coming from a baseline of real despair and climate alarm, that seems like incredible progress. We've basically cut in half our expectations for warming this century in just 5 years. And we haven't even been moving all that quickly, all things considered. We're building an energy transition that's faster than any energy transition that's ever happened, but it's also much slower than it could be or than it can be if we really threw ourselves into it. And how you think about all of those facts, as I say, it says a lot more about you than it says about the climate system. 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees, we're talking about really dramatic impacts. From the vantage of today, they look incredibly grim. Just to give a very brief summary, at 2 degrees, we're expecting 150 million additional premature deaths from air pollution from the burning of fossil fuels to get us to 2 degrees. 150 million additional premature deaths. We're talking about once a century coastal flooding events happening every single year in many parts of the world, actually happening multiple times a year. So if you think about what used to count as a once a century event and how long it was remembered by local cultures, in some cases by cultures that were basically destroyed by those flooding events, we're now talking about encountering that level of flooding every single year, just about everywhere in the world. Across South Asia and the Middle East, we're talking about extreme heat getting so bad that for long stretches of the summer, even young and healthy people wouldn't really be able to move around much outside without risking some risk of heat stroke or heat death even. And that's a future that is almost baked in, and it counts based on where I was expecting things to be a few years ago as real progress. And that's the kind of paradox of considering the climate future from the vantage of today. There is a lot of reason for optimism. Things are getting better, but they're also at the same time getting worse. And we know that they're going to get worse. We know they're going to get considerably worse. And to hold those two ideas in your head at the same time is quite tricky. But that's the bind we've put ourselves in.
Yeah. So along those lines, I mean, you've made the point that the planet we're living on now is hotter. It's different. It's a different planet from the history of civilization. Human beings have never lived on a planet like this before. And today, right now, is the best climate we're going to get going forward. It's only going to get worse from here. So, related to that, the title we have is Life After Climate Change, but there is no after climate. So how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one basic conceptual framework is, as you say, that we're now living on a different planet already. Humans have never walked on a planet as hot as this one. And that means, to the extent that everything we have done as a species is dependent on the natural environment in which we've occupied, we now have to reconsider what of those systems, rituals, expectations, which we've developed in some cases over decades, in some cases over centuries, in some cases over millennia or more, which of those have to be discarded and abandoned, which have to be renovated and reformed, and which can survive life on an entirely new planet. Now, it's not exactly the case that everywhere on Earth is going through unprecedented experience of climate. Like, one way of thinking of it is that northern cities are now just living like southern cities. Southern cities are now living like equatorial cities, and on down the line. But the way that our bodies have acclimated, the way that our agricultural systems, our political dynamics, locally, nationally, and globally, all of those are being thrown into really, by geological timescales, rapid chaos. And we don't really know what that is going to mean. The speed of change it's funny because a lot of people think about climate change as a slow disaster, which in certain ways it is. The world 500 years from now is going to be a lot more different, presumably, than the world 50 years from now, in part because so much ice is likely to melt that we're going to get, dozens of meters of sea level rise and, enough water to flood 2/3 of the world's major cities. But, even putting that aside, we think of this as like a problem that our grandparents created in the Industrial Revolution and in the 19th century into the early 20th. And it's a problem that our grandchildren are going to have to be dealing with because it takes that long to play out. But it's actually, in other ways, an incredibly fast-moving story in which half of all the emissions that have ever been produced in the history of humanity have come in the last 25 years, which is since the warnings were issued to the Senate about climate change. It's since Al Gore published his first book about warming. It's since the UN established its climate change body. It's since the premiere of Friends, I often say. This is happening very fast. It's happening in my lifetime. I'm 41 years old. Something like 60% of all the warming that's ever happened, or all the fossil pollution that's ever happened in the history of humanity has happened in my lifetime. I extended back to my father's lifetime. He was born in 1938. It's he died already, but it's like 92% of all the damage that's ever been done was done in the period of my father's lifetime and my lifetime. And we're now living in a period in which we are reckoning with those impacts. We're seeing unprecedented wildfire, crazy off-the-charts temperatures, which scientists are struggling to explain in real time. Mass coral reef die-off and ocean death, biodiversity loss, where the World Wildlife Foundation says 70% of animal populations have declined in the last few decades. Insect populations are estimated to have dropped by 60, 70, 80%, depending on the region. We are already living in a very different world from the one our grandparents occupied, but the one that our children and grandchildren will be occupying is very different, again, another order of difference. And we are very slow in thinking about what that means, what challenges it poses for us at a political level, at an infrastructural level, but also at an individual level, at a psychological level, at an emotional level, for our politics, for our ethics, for our sense of economics, and the stories of progress and technological trajectories that we used to, we used to like put ourselves to sleep at night, like little fairy tales. All of those things are very much in question. And I'm not somebody who thinks that the climate challenge is beyond the capacity of humans to respond. The natural disasters that we see today are just the natural landscape on which we will be building a future, but we will build that future. The question is what kind of future it will be, how adequately it will protect our fellow humans from climate disasters, who it will expose, when it will expose them, and what sorts of expectations we will carry forward about the future in passing through this, what we hope is a relatively brief on geologic timescales, period of dramatic change followed, we hope, by some stability. But that part of the answer too is dependent on what we do. If we don't adequately restrain fossil fuel use, we won't see climate temperatures stabilize. We will see them just continuing to rise, probably a little bit more slowly, but continuing to rise for centuries or even millennia from now. And, some things that unfold at that timescale, some changes are workable, we can live with on that timescale. But even just on a personal psychological level, the idea that the natural world that I observed or read about in children's books, or I'm reading about to my children now in children's books, is already a relic of a natural world. It's already gone. Those are museum pieces. It's like walking into the Natural History Museum and seeing models of extinct animals. That natural world is dead. And the world that will be available to us a century from now is foreign still. And the project of navigating that transition is the project of our generation. And it's a project that involves figuring out how to limit warming so that temperatures actually stabilize. It's also a project of figuring out how to live in that world and how to make sense of it as a species that has had a complicated, contradictory, sometimes tortured relationship to nature for a very long time, maybe ever, depending on how you want to think about it. And I think we've had a climate awakening in recent years. People are aware more than they used to, but some of these deeper foundational questions about how climate change challenges or undermines our relationship to the natural world and our expectations for the future, I think are very much open questions, which we are just beginning to patch together piecemeal answers to.
Yeah, see, the doom part is pretty clear. So
That was my optimistic.
Yeah, that's right. Along these lines, so you had mentioned earlier about nonlinearities and feedback loops, and since I'm a physicist, that always kind of grabs my attention. This is kind of where the physics is most interesting. It's the hardest part of nature to understand. And there are lots of those in the climate system. And I just wonder if you could, maybe speak a little bit to that. There's the sort of feedback where things could dramatically change in a way that we can't undo.
Yeah, I think the most striking research that I've read about feedback loops is it's not something that's on most scientists' front of mind because it happens only at a relatively high level of warming. But at something like, I think it's at something like 5 degrees of warming, the planet might entirely lose its ability to form clouds, which would be so significant in climate terms because clouds reflect a lot of sunlight, and so they effectively, some of them warm the earth, but a lot of others cool them. And anyway, it's a complicated system. But at that point, we might, if we lose cloud system cover, we could add as much as 8 additional degrees of warming basically instantaneously. So we would go from about 5 degrees to about 13 degrees, which, whatever you think about the survivability of human civilization at 5 degrees, 13 is not, it's not going to happen. So, other nonlinearities and tipping points are, some of them are more scientifically sure. We know that the ice sheets are going to melt. We basically know that we have made that ice loss permanent and irreversible already, or on the brink of making it irreversible already, which means that we can alter the speed at which we lose all of the planet's ice, but we can't really alter the volume. and the volume is, like I said a few minutes ago, it's like hundreds of feet of sea level rise, like 260 feet, I think, in total, if we lose all the world's ice. There was just a paper out this week about ice loss in Greenland that said that I think it was there are 30 billion tons of ice being lost every day. Is that right? 30 million? 30 billion?
Million sounds high.
It's like 70 billion for every person alive on planet Earth since 1970 or something. One of the things that's just in general, to step away from non-linearities and just talk about scale for a second, like when you start thinking about especially the transformations that are likely in these really large-scale climate systems, it's a reminder of just how enormous these things are. I mean, you know, every single transatlantic flight from New York to Europe, every seat on that plane melts 9 square meters of ice, of Arctic ice, and those planes are flying like all day, every day. I mean, and there's a huge amount of water being added to the seas, but it's also just a reminder of just how much ice there is in the system. And I went through this earlier with you today, but for me, the thing that signals the scale of the change most dramatically is that we know the weight of the carbon that we've put up into the atmosphere. We can, measure it by weight. And it weighs more. The damage we've done to the planet's atmosphere weighs more than everything we've ever built on planet Earth. So we've transformed the planet's atmosphere more substantially than we've transformed the planet's surface. And that stuff that's up there, because it hangs in the atmosphere, most of it for centuries or millennia, is effectively permanent, which means it is not only the largest monument to human civilization that we've ever built, it's also almost certainly the longest lasting. We can take it out maybe through negative emissions. There are things we can do to maybe reduce that carbon content, but without large-scale industrial intervention into the atmosphere, we are talking about having built a carbon heating blanket for the planet, which cannot be turned off or turned down on any human timescale. And the ultimate weight of that carbon blanket is more than everything we've ever managed to do on this planet. And it's also, by the way, more than the sum total of all living things on Earth. Sorry.
Sorry, can you repeat what can cause the cloud cover to fail again?
Oh, it's just at a certain temperature level. I think it's at 5 degrees. It's just a temperature level projection. And these are when you're talking about transformations like these, it's really hard to wrap your head around. The impacts are so large. It's a reminder that the planet is very large. Another thing I think about a lot is climate scientists will always say 90% of the extra heat in the atmosphere is being absorbed in the ocean. And it took me until last year until I realized that means that the ocean's been hit by 9 times as much warming as the planet that we live on, the land. And the ocean is being transformed at speeds that are completely unfathomable to ocean scientists who really feel even more than those of us studying the climate of life above water, that we are in completely unprecedented territory and really know very little about what's going to happen. They have lots of questions about how the circulation patterns will change, how the fish populations will survive, whether the plankton, which provide much of the world's oxygen, will be able to endure these new conditions. And in all of these cases, we are navigating, we talk about this and we're like, believe the science and trust the science. But the science has so much uncertainty around all of it. And many of those uncertainties are quite scary. And we do want to trust the science, it's the best guide to this unknowable future. But I think in some profound way, we also have to acknowledge that that future is unknowable and that we should have some mix of humility and precaution in trying to think about it and trying to plan for it.
Yeah. I mean, you've made the point. So last year was this hottest year on record. We probably broke the 1.5 degree limit, and we don't really know why. And that's just this past year. Never mind trying to project 20 years down the road.
Yeah, so this is, we have an underlying warming trend. Scientists are like, that's the main thing obviously going on here. We know global warming's happening. We know it's real. There are a number of other factors that made 2023 really exceptional. And, there were months in the year where we were breaking records by like completely unimaginable margins. And overall, we jumped over last year's average temperature by an unprecedented degree. There were some days where we didn't just break the 1.5 degree barrier, we were actually 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial average. Just a couple days, but nevertheless, really, really large jumps. And scientists are like, we don't really know why that happened. This is getting a little weedsy and technical, but there's, it's an El Nino year in the Pacific that is about the weather dynamics in the Pacific, and it generally adds some amount of warming to the global average temperature. But actually at this point in the El Nino cycle, we would not be expecting much, if any, effect from the El Nino. Much of that was supposed to be happening next year, given where we are in the El Nino cycle. Yeah. So while there probably is some El Nino effect, maybe we're having a different kind of an El Nino now because we've never had an El Nino at this temperature before. Maybe it looks like this now, we don't know. There's some expected impact from, there was a super volcano explosion that sent all of this water vapor up into the atmosphere, again at a scale that's like, if I quoted the number, it would be unbelievable because it seems so large. But there's a ton of extra water vapor in the atmosphere still a year and a half later because of this super volcano. And water vapor, most people don't know this, but most water vapor is a greenhouse gas, so it's up there and it's heating the planet additionally to some degree, but most scientists think their estimates for how much of an effect that's happening is quite small. People wondering about reductions of sulfur emissions from transatlantic shipping might be having an effect because when we burn fossil fuels, in addition to producing carbon, we produce a lot of particulate matter that reflects sunlight back into the atmosphere. And so in addition to the carbon warming effect, we have a planet cooling effect that counteracts it. And if we change the kind of pollution that we're producing by cleaning up the air and making it healthier to breathe, we'll actually reduce the cooling effect and therefore effectively produce additional warming. Some people think that's already happening at pretty significant scales. Scientifically uncertain, we don't know. The path of Saharan dust being blown across the Atlantic seemed to have had some effect, but probably not a large effect. Anyway, scientists are adding up all of these variables and they say, we just can't get to the temperature level that we saw this year. That we don't know how we got from where we were last year to where we are today. And that is, you mentioned this earlier in talking about it, but it's like, this is the world that we're living in right now. Our eyes are open. We have temperature sensors everywhere around the world. We're watching the cloud cover. We're watching all of this stuff. We're watching it like a hawk. And scientists are running the math all the time. And them doing that in real time this year, not talking about 2100, not talking about 2200. This year, they're like, we don't know. We don't know how it got this hot. Some of them think it's going to cool down. It'll revert to the mean next year. Other people think we're at a new normal and it'll keep accelerating. We don't know. And, again, it's just, this is a big, messy climate system. We're running an experiment on it that we've never run before. The climate's changing 10 times or maybe even 100 times faster than it's ever changed before in planetary history. And most of the times when it's changed at anything like this speed, which is to say 1/10 or 1/100th as fast, it's been a mass extinction that's killed 60, 70, 80, 90% of all life on Earth. We're doing the changes we're doing at a much faster rate, and our science can't really keep up.
Well, so no one has to worry because we just had COP28 and all the nations have come together and it was incredibly successful. It was considered historic, and let me read the sentence that is why everyone got so excited. It's that parties are to be transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. And that was considered a big deal. Is it a big deal? How do we...
Well, basically no. But the fact that it's not a big deal is kind of good news because the world is already transitioning its power systems away from fossil fuels. So the COP commitment was endorsing a transition that is already underway. It's already underway in petrostates. which includes the United States, by the way. The United States is a petrostate. It's the world's largest producer of oil. It's the world's second largest exporter of oil. It's the world's largest producer of natural gas. It's the world's largest exporter of natural gas. We think of ourselves as one of the good guys and those bad guys in the Middle East, but like we're doing actually more damage than all those countries. And by historical measure, we've done way more damage than all those countries. In fact, we've done more damage than any other country in the world. We've done twice as much damage as any other country in the world historically. And because carbon hangs in the atmosphere forever, you actually can tally up historical emissions and count them as equivalent to contemporary and future emissions, much as American politicians don't like to admit. I was just talking about this earlier, but a year or two ago, I wrote a piece where I tabulated climate damages based on historical emissions for the U.S. using an optimistic estimated cost for what it would take to undo the climate from the atmosphere, which is like $100 a ton. Some people hope we could get to a place where we could take it out of the atmosphere at $100 a ton. And at that level, the U.S. would owe the world $50 trillion in climate damages. And by even the Biden administration's official estimate of the social cost of carbon, the U.S. is today imposing $1 trillion of climate damages on the rest of the world every single year. So, whenever the U.S. talks, whenever Americans talk about climate villainy in China, climate villainy in India, how those people need to get their act together, we really need to remind ourselves, look in the mirror. This is primarily a U.S. problem. We have created this crisis, and we have a moral, political, and fiscal responsibility to, I think, try to do something about it. But even here, we are moving relatively quickly to get off of fossil fuels. I think a dozen states are now producing a majority of their electricity from renewable sources. Many of those are actually some of the deepest red states in the country, so it crosses against partisan lines in ways that many people don't appreciate. South Dakota is getting 97% of its power from renewables. Texas is at 40%. It's going to be 50% by Inauguration Day 2025. And all across Europe, basically everybody is, majority renewables already. So the world is moving quite quickly in that direction, and they're doing that for a number of reasons. They're doing it because there are public health benefits. 10 million people a year die from the air pollution produced from the burning of fossil fuels. And so, that damage is concentrated locally. If you can get off those fossil fuels, your people will benefit. But they're also doing it because the cost of renewable power is actually much cheaper now than dirty energy alternatives. Depending on the estimate, as much as 95 or 99% of the world now living in places where new renewable energy is cheaper than new dirty energy. And many parts of the world, something like half the world, new renewable energy is actually cheaper than continuing to operate existing fossil fuel plants. So for all of these reasons, in the power sector, the transition is moving relatively quickly. I think there's a lot more that governments can do. We should be moving faster, but the direction of change is clear, the momentum is there. And so to affirm in that kind of diplomatic setting that we're going to transition the power sector away from fossil fuels is functionally a meaningless commitment. But it's the first time it was said in one of these conferences. It was the first time there was any hint of we need to get off fossil fuels. In fact, for many of these conferences, they wouldn't even allow the phrase fossil fuels to be used in the official text. And it does raise the question of, okay, then what if it's only for the power sector? What about industry? What about infrastructure? What about agriculture? What about buildings? And maybe we'll get there next. So one hopes that this is a stepping stone rhetorical commitment that will lead the world to ask harder questions going forward and maybe make deeper and more serious pledges at the next go-round or at the national level, working independently of the geopolitical consensus.
Yeah. Okay. So, as you know, UChicago has this new climate systems engineering initiative, and for probably most people in the room know this, but it's things like we're going to shoot particles up into the stratosphere to change properties of the Earth. We're going to engineer the system, and you can argue we're already engineering our system, and so we might as well do it deliberately and think through what we're doing. And desperate times call for desperate measures, but it is certainly desperate and unsettling given how complicated the system is. I just wonder what your thoughts are about geoengineering.
Well, my basic thought is that we should understand what it would mean to do it. And that means that we should be researching its effects. Personally, I think I would say that without that information, without much of that information, I'm worried. I would be worried about such a large-scale intervention in the climate system, and I would be worried that there would be large, unforeseen effects on agriculture, on rain yields, on flooding, drought, that we weren't able to adequately model ahead of time or understand or appreciate. And as many people who've thought about this and written about this have noted, it raises a whole suite of geopolitical challenges, because if we're effectively at 3 degrees of warming, but we've cooled ourselves artificially to 1.5 or 1, because we're keeping a umbrella of particles suspended in the atmosphere permanently by constant re-injection, which is what it would require because the stuff dissipates relatively quickly, then that makes the whole system vulnerable to sabotage by particular states or terrorists. There's just a lot of we could take some action to punish someone else, to make our rival state suffer. I try not to get too drawn into those sci-fi game theory kind of scenarios, because I think in the real world the risks are probably somewhat less that a state would actually effectively drop 2 degrees of warming on the rest of the world out of spite. But the management of the system would obviously be a geopolitical challenge, which I don't think we've really solved yet. But even short of that, we just don't know. If we double the amount of carbon we have in the atmosphere, but artificially change how much effect that has on our climate, we just don't really know how that's all going to shake out. And I'd really be, I really want to know one way or the other.
Yeah, fair enough. So you've written a lot about the COVID pandemic, kind of as a separate career, one of the questions there has been, how did we do, and perhaps more importantly, how confident do you feel, how prepared are we for the next pandemic? And what are the lessons from the COVID pandemic for our ability to tackle climate change?
Yeah, I mean, it's, putting aside the climate change question for a second, my basic perspective on the pandemic is that it is absolutely wild that we lived through a sort of once-a-century world historical trauma in which 1.5 million Americans and 25 million people around the world died of a novel disease. We spent a chunk of that time kind of bunkered down in a panic, and then a protracted period of time trying to navigate a new landscape that was defined by more anxiety than we had lived with before. And we came out of that, and we're now 4 years out of it, or 3 years out of the depths of it. And we're all kind of acting like it was not like a big deal or something. And we there was this whole spate of articles about why Americans are so gloomy about the state of the world recently, and it's well, maybe it's because 1.5 million Americans died, and we all had a terrible experience of the last couple of years, and we're so socially dislocated and frustrated in certain ways at our government and angry at our fellow citizens. It just introduced a huge amount of social discord that I think we have not processed at all as individuals or as a society. And I think that we're in a very strange place about the pandemic. We still argue about it, we still relitigate it, but we also kind of forgot it. And in fact, when we argue about it, we often get things wrong. We talk about things totally out of context. We get the timelines wrong. People, this is so petty, but I was recently watching a podcast with Bill Maher and Billy Corgan, and Bill Maher was if you wanted to limit the pandemic spread right early on, I could understand doing a lockdown for a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, but not a couple years. And I was I looked it up, and it was Bill Maher didn't miss a single fucking show. He broadcast all the way through the pandemic, and for a stretch of a few months there was not an audience there, but we did not live in bunkers for 2 years isolated from one another. But we tell ourselves that as though like any reminder that the pandemic is still present, anytime we see someone with a mask, we're like, that's a lockdown. It's like, that's not a lockdown, that's a fucking mask that one person decided to wear because they were scared. And I'm wearing a mask, and I haven't worn a mask for a very long time, and I think they were pretty limited utility. But I'm not gonna get mad at someone for wearing it into a classroom because like they're scared. That's not, but we're so tangled up. We have so much anger that's displaced. We're unhappy with the pandemic, so we're angry about, we like blame it on other people. We want to say it was this party's fault or that party's fault or these people's fault or that people's fault. And it's just like, we just had a really hard time because we lived through a world historical trauma, and that's really hard. But that's not to say that we can't learn anything from it. And I think the lessons are complicated. As it relates to climate change, I still find the most inspiring lesson the fact that really early on, the world moved really quickly out of fear to protect itself. And we went from, in the US, literally like Tony Fauci saying, you got to worry more about the flu, to stay at home in like a month. And that was not just true in the US, it was not just true in Europe, it was true all across the world. In April and May of 2023, we had more than 1 billion kids out of school around the world. Now, you might find fault with that, depending on your perspective on school closures, but just as a measure of how fundamentally we were willing as a planet, as a species, to reorder our lives, yes, presumably temporarily, but still reorder them very fundamentally out of a sense of imminent fear, I think it's really, really striking. We suspended our romantic lives, we suspended our economic lives, we suspended our social lives. And we did that because we were worried and we didn't want to damage the people around us or make them suffer, especially those who are most vulnerable. That is like, for people who would have said 5 years ago, nobody's ever going to do anything about climate change because people don't care about one another, that's a pretty powerful counter-argument. Yeah. Now, our willingness to keep up those measures dissipated relatively quickly. And maybe we asked people to do too much, or maybe we moved, too soon in parts of the world where the virus wasn't really a threat, so they were responding in the absence of real risk, as opposed to, dealing with it, more directly and more locally. We all around the world came to distrust our political leaders. We came to distrust our political leaders when they were lenient, and we came to distrust our political leaders when they were too stringent. I don't know exactly what that says about climate or what that even says about the pandemic, except that sometimes human life is complicated and difficult, and that we shouldn't ask our politics to solve it neatly, but take the political responsibility of managing struggling and suffering together as a collective responsibility that we have to build institutions to protect and honor as individuals. But it's hard, and I think we, with climate too, we can't pretend that we're going to snap our fingers and come up with a solution. I think there's a really optimistic lesson in the work that was done around Operation Warp Speed for the development of the vaccines. I think that, many of us look back, sometimes I look back on the pandemic and think, what a disaster. But honestly, it could have been a lot worse. Those vaccines were developed in record time. They were designed within 2 days of the genome being published. They were being produced within 2 months of the genome being published. They were being put up into clinical trials by May of 2020. We could have accelerated that even more. We could have got them into arms even sooner. There's an interesting counterfactual because they delayed the approval of the vaccines until after the election, and it's possible that if they had been approved before the election, Trump would have won the re-election, and as a result would have become probably a voice in support of vaccines, and whether we would have had the polarization of vaccines that might have really changed things. But putting that aside, we had within a year shots going into arms. Within a year of a totally new virus being discovered, we had shots going into arms in the millions, in the tens of millions. And because of those shots, we probably saved something like 30, 40 million lives globally. It's not to say we did a perfect job with it. We basically didn't vaccinate the global south, which meant that they had a really quite brutal 2022 and 2023, which they didn't have to endure. And obviously in the US too, the vaccine uptake is a mixed picture. But even there, I think, if you had said to me at the outset of the whole thing, we're going to rush these vaccines into development, and within 18 months, 95% of American seniors where the bulk of the risk is concentrated are going to be vaccinated, I would have said that's a pretty good record. And that's where we ended up. And in fact, it's higher than that. The CDC, they got embarrassed with some of their counts, so they don't even tell you if you get above 95% in a particular demographic group, so it's probably like 98 or 99% of American seniors, and that's the vast bulk of COVID risk. We got it taken care of. Vaccine hesitancy was really not much of a problem among the people for whom vaccines were most protective and most important. And that's really amazing.
Yeah.
And that tells us too that things that seem like moonshots can come in on time and save the day.
Yeah. Go science. So along those lines, and you alluded to this, there's also been this kind of erosion of trust in government and in science and authority, in the media, among society, between countries. There just seems to be this kind of growing divide, and we seem to be kind of going into this post-truth era. And so being a journalist as this is happening, how bad is it? How do we fix it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'm someone who I myself am often skeptical of conventional narratives and public narratives.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have found some of the impulses towards, skepticism of elites over the last couple of years kind of exhilarating. In the pandemic, it seemed very important to me for a lot of people to be asking a lot of complicated questions. On the other hand, it was also dispiriting how many people who were sort of obviously wrong about a bunch of stuff were getting a lot of interest and support on the basis of those obviously wrong claims. But just to pause for a second there before I get to the big question about the state of truth in the world, there are a lot of different ways to tell the story of the pandemic, and you can tell very different stories even working from true, reliable, accurately compiled and analyzed data. So for instance, you can look at what's called age-adjusted death rate in a population. So controlling for demographics, how many people in a population died at a certain time. And this is one way that we can see that cancer rates have been basically declining, cancer death rates have been declining over time. And if you look at that chart over time, there's a giant jump in 2020, and there's a giant jump, a little bit smaller jump in 2021 in the US. But those jumps actually bring us only to the level that the US was at in the year 2000. So we had way more death in 2020 and 2021 than we had in 2017 or 2018. But we had basically the same amount of death as we had in the year 2000, when I was 18 years old and I looking around and I didn't think there was that much death around. Both of those things are true. Based on the experience of the recent past, the pandemic was an incredible anomaly, and one would hope it could have been preventable. But in the broad sweep of history, it was not a setback to death of the level of the Black Death. It was not a setback to the level of even the 1918 flu. It was a much smaller setback than that. And how we think about those two sets of facts, depends a lot on what kind of question we're trying to answer, what our basic temperamental inclinations are in thinking about progress and the shape of the future. But ultimately, you can tell two very contradictory stories using the exact same data. Or to tell another little story, you can look at just crude death rate. And people did this a lot in 2020 and said, oh my God, the US is failing. The US is dying. there's so much more death from COVID in 2020 than any of our peer countries. You adjust just for like population size, and you're like, oh, actually, the U.S. is doing maybe a little bit worse than its peers, but it's not that much worse. Sort of in the, there are a bunch of countries that did worse than us in Europe, for instance, in 2020. If you model excess mortality, which is like, given population trends and disease trends, how much more death did we see than was expected for that year? The US gets even better, and the story stops being about how the rich countries of the world did so poorly in fighting this disease, which was the main public narrative in 2020. And you start to ask the question of why did all of Eastern Europe suffer so poorly? Because by far, the countries that were hit by far hit the hardest were Russia, Lithuania, Serbia, all these countries in the former Soviet bloc. But you can also correct that data for demographics. So assuming that everybody's population was age structured the same way, who did the worst? And then, so you've already moved from like US and Western Europe is the problem to Eastern Europe is the problem. And if you adjust for demographics, all of the worst hit countries in the world were in sub-Saharan Africa. And we do not talk about, that is not the story that we tell about this at all. And there's a reason for that, which is that they're not the same populations. They're much younger, which means in total numbers, they had many fewer deaths. But all of these stories are all true, and yet they totally contradict one another and give us very different meanings to extract from this experience. And so when I think about all of the arguments about like how Sweden did in the pandemic, I just think, like climate change, the pandemic was too messy experience to reduce to a single narrative, and it's best viewed almost kaleidoscopically from a variety of angles at once. That said, I wish more Americans got vaccinated in 2021 pretty quickly. I think we would have saved a couple 100,000 American lives, and that's really significant. I wish that there wasn't a lot of vitriol directed at people who were behaving irresponsibly in one way or the other. I wish that we didn't turn on each other in that way. I wish that we didn't talk about the virus as a Republican virus or a Democratic virus. There's a lot of shit that we did that I really regret I regret on behalf of our culture. But ultimately, I think that we have to also keep some of this stuff in perspective and remember that for all the vaccine skepticism that we worry about, 95 to 99% of the people who needed to get vaccinated got vaccinated pretty quickly. And those who we were frustrated about and angry about not getting vaccinated were people who could have benefited, younger, middle-aged people, they could have benefited from vaccination, but they were facing much smaller risks than the very old. And it is not totally unreasonable for them to make different decisions about their own lives. That's one big area in which we had fights over truth.
Yes.
I don't like how pervasive the idea is in certain quarters now that we're having large-scale excess mortality because of vaccine adverse events. I think that that's really obviously bullshit. But, I don't think it's bad that there are some people out there asking, where are the adverse events? Like, we should be thinking about this stuff. At a large, if we vaccinate 250 million Americans, there are probably going to be some people who have some side effects that are really quite bad. Another area where we dealt with, the question of shared truth was like whether the people who died really died of COVID. Yeah. That is one that I get much more agitated about. I think the degree to which we are willing to literally say that these people didn't die or diminish their deaths by describing them as people who would have died anyway under other circumstances, I think is really inhumane and conspiratorial. But ultimately, I think less a matter of truth than about humanity. Yeah. And that one of the ways that we made ourselves feel better about living through a pandemic was by telling ourselves that it wasn't really a pandemic. That's ugly. It's an ugly lesson. but I think we probably have to learn it going forward, and thinking maybe in particular about the way that climate change affects people differentially, punishing people in the global south, punishing people who live elsewhere around the world, and the way in which everyone will look at those impacts and find a way to excuse them or normalize them or just look away and not acknowledge them, and try to build some kind of culture or institution that makes it hard to do that.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to end. That is probably our greatest challenge. So I think we'll stop here for now. We'll take a break for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll have Q&A. So,
So what level of personal responsibility do you think we share in trying to combat like the climate crisis? Because in my case, like, I mean, this is probably a bad thing, but I usually like. I'm sorry. Is it working?
no.
Okay, then just be really loud.
Okay. So no, in my case, I'm sort of like, okay, whatever I'm going to do is not going to change that much anyways, and so, I'll vote in elections for whoever I think will have an impact, but when it comes to my own personal decisions, I don't really think too much about climate. So yeah, I don't know, if you could just explore a little bit more sort of the personal responsibility aspect.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I relate to the problem in much the same way that you do, which is that I think it's the only honest thing to say that, if we're hoping to really make a dent in this problem, it requires systems change, that requires political action, and that you simply can't mass enough individual scale behavior change to make much of a difference. That's true because of the scale of the problem. It's also because of the nature of the things we need to decarbonize. So you can't choose what kind of power you're drawing on when you turn on the light in your home. You may be able to buy an electric vehicle, but if you're charging it off a coal station, it's not that great. There are a lot of things like that where like the choices that are made available to you are the result of systems which you do not control as a consumer. And I think one of the problematic features of our lives as 21st century Americans is that we've been raised to believe that we make our mark on the world through what we buy. And the truth is that we make a much bigger mark through our politics if we choose to lean that way. So, at a global level, from the top down, I think this is a problem that requires political action and political change. The impact that individuals can have through politics, I think, is much larger than the impact that they can have through their own individual choices, and that people should behave responsibly and try to live within their own values. So if they feel obligated, morally or otherwise, to be more responsible in terms of climate, there are many things you can do to take action. If they feel like they want to be part of a group of people who are starting to behave in different ways, that's great too. The more that you talk about and share your concerns, on some level, that's a small-scale political intervention too. But ultimately, the greatest value, even in individual behavior choices, is that it signals to those around you that you're willing to change, that you're focused on the problem, and you think it's a problem. And that matters more than if you as an American have a carbon footprint this year of 15 tons or 16 tons or 14 tons. The hope is that we relatively rapidly get to a net zero world in which the choices we make have no carbon responsibility associated with them at all, and we don't have to worry about our carbon footprints because all the energy we use and all the travel we do and all the food we eat and all the clothes we buy and the houses we live in and all of those things have no temperature rise associated with them at all. And getting to that future when we don't have to worry about it is a matter of basically of politics and large-scale social change. The one last thing I would say about it is, navigating this ethical, moral landscape as you are, also feel some guilt about it, as it sounds a little bit like you do, that you know, you're going to vote, you're going to do whatever, but you're also like haven't bothered to change your, you know, the basic shape of your personal life. And that gets name called a lot in our culture as hypocrisy. But I often like to say hypocrisy, what we call hypocrisy, is often our desire to live better collectively than we do as individuals. And we shouldn't always be name calling that impulse. That's like good politics. We don't ask people who think we should have a higher top marginal tax rate to donate all their income to charity before they can credibly defend higher taxes. We say, no, this is a thing that you can rally for in the political sphere, whatever your personal commitments are. And I think the same really should be true of climate. And I would like to see more people see that clearly so that they get over that initial barrier of thinking, I'm not qualified to be a climate advocate. I'm not qualified even to talk to my loved ones about it because I'm not myself yet living right. None of us are going to be living right on this planet until we're at net zero. And the job of getting to net zero is much more of a political challenge than an individual challenge.
Our microphones are not working, so Dan, I'm interested if you call on people.
Okay, and we can also, Agnes, please. But,
So, just one, sorry. So like a couple of years ago, I read somewhere that the most, you don't have to go anywhere, you can sit there.
We can use this microphone, which is working.
Oh, I see, to give to whoever's asking the question. Okay, good idea. So I read that the sort of issue that's most directly correlated with like your making predictions about what political party you belong to is climate change. Like that is of all the abortion, etc. This was a couple of years ago. It might be 21. But that like how worried you are about climate change strongly predicts your political orientation. So that suggests climate change is or was at the time when I read this, highly politicized. Maybe it's a little less now. My question is why? Why would this issue be politicized? You mentioned like with the vaccines, you know, maybe it would have been less politicized if Trump had won. So that's a story we can tell. What's the story we're going to tell about why climate change has been politicized?
Well, I'll try to answer that in a second, but I just want to say first, I think the main story about partisanship and climate, at least in the United States, is the conventional story that it is so partisan is really quite out of date. And you still see in polling a huge divide between Republicans and Democrats about whether they say they're worried about climate change, whether they believe it's real or human caused. All those things show up in the polling data. But I look at the last few years, which saw a party line vote, budget reconciliation passage of a contentious climate bill that the Democrats forced through at the last minute, a couple months before the midterms, at a time when American gas prices were basically at an all-time high, and paid no cost in the midterms that followed. In fact, Republicans basically didn't even bother to make it an election issue. And when you compare that to the fallout from the Affordable Care Act, it is just so different. The Affordable Care Act mobilized Republicans in the 2010 midterms. It mobilized them in the 2012 campaign. It mobilized them in 2014, mobilized them in 2016. Donald Trump ran in part on repealing Obamacare, which had been passed almost a decade before. And he made it his main goal, his main legislative goal was repealing Obamacare. He wasn't able to do it because John McCain voted against it, but he built it, and he didn't accomplish much in office as a result because he made that effort and he failed. The response to the IRA, which is a bill comparable in size, in many ways potentially more transformational to many aspects of American life than the healthcare bill, has been basic silence on the Republican side. And I think that that's a taste of where we're heading because the green transition is such good economics. It's especially good economics in red states that while Republicans aren't likely to sign up for aggressive climate bills, especially ones that are more aggro about, keeping it in the ground or whatever than the IRA was, they're also not really going to make a stink about it because, there are huge numbers of jobs pouring into red states as a result. They're already profiting from it, and they already, at some basic level, like all of us, think that like cleaner air is better than air that's been polluted by fossil fuel plants. So for all of those reasons, I think it's a remarkable story, but I think it's a very profound story and one that almost no one appreciates, that like climate change, which has long been described as this culture war lightning rod, passed through what counts in America as like a political fight and solution to the problem that generated almost no backlash from the opposition party, which is a party that has long defined itself through fossil fuel identity. The fact that that happened, I think, means that we're, at least for the moment, in a much smoother place than most people feared. And I actually think in many ways smoother than they're going through in Europe, where they're having many more direct political backlash to climate policies. Now, why it got politicized in the first place, and why it became so divisive, I think the short answer is not particular to climate change. It's that solutions, or the program being offered to decarbonize, the project to decarbonize, was advanced by a certain demographic set, high education, wealthy, coastal Americans, and described in its crudest terms, that program meant a restructuring of the way of life of many of the people who lived in the middle of the country. And so, not wanting to drive as much, not wanting to eat as much beef, not wanting to like celebrate the prosperity produced by the oil and gas business. All of these things it's just a kind of a classic illustration, instantiation of the basic education polarization story that we've seen play out around the world over the last couple of decades. And, in America in particular, things grew more intense, I think basically because the Republican Party was more captured by fossil fuel interests than conservative parties elsewhere in the world have been, at least elsewhere in the rich world. And exactly why that happened is a story about, American political economy. It has to do with, the importance of Texas in the Republican imagination. It has to do with the Koch brothers, who are, fossil fuel billionaires. And all of that stuff kind of came together. But I don't think that like the conventional, reflexive, just so story that liberals tell themselves about why there's polarization on this is wrong. I think it's basically like, Republicans didn't want to change their way of life. It sounded to them like liberals wanted to, and that was offensive and noxious to them. And the reason that that has softened is because in red places, we now can see that the disruptions are not as dramatic. And in fact, we are probably better and healthier and safer in a greener future. And so, to the extent, even just 5 years ago, when AOC's office posted this FAQ about the Green New Deal that included some joking line about how we're going to take away everyone's hamburgers, that became like a thing that Republicans like really talked about. Nobody talks about that kind of thing anymore. Because they're just like, oh, like all the climate action means is like tax breaks for solar power, so I don't have to breathe in this coal smoke anymore. That sounds like a pretty good deal to anyone. Now, we may see another stage in which polarization and resistance returns when we get into some of the thornier stages of decarbonizing transportation. So if red states or the federal government starts instituting bans on internal combustion vehicles like states like California have done already, probably that'll produce a large backlash. If we start talking about agriculture and land use in ways that feel violative of the kind of, maybe not even the cultural lives of Republicans today, but the way that they imagine their identity and how it's tied up in their relationship to the land, there'll probably be some backlash there too, which is another reason that Europe may be suffering a little more than us, is because they're a little farther along in some of those transitions. But for the time being, I think this stage, the transformation of the power sector, the transition of the power sector, has just proven to be much less disruptive to the lives of most Americans than was feared because of the changing economics of renewable energy. So 10 or 15 years ago, anyone talking about the green transition would have described it as a burden. And it was going to be costly, it was going to be difficult. Your electricity bills were going to go up. Maybe they would say, we need to do this, but it would be a burden. And now, because of the incredible fall in cost of renewable energy, that logic doesn't apply. Economists will tell you, to a person, we'll be wealthier on the other side, we'll be healthier on the other side. Electricity will be cheaper, it's already cheaper. And so the whole logic of like, this is a cultural change that they're going to dump on our shoulders just hasn't materialized. And I think that's made the political salience, has really weakened the political salience of it. Yeah.
So if there's a change of administration, you don't think they'll make repealing the IRA a big part of what they try to do?
I think that the Trump administration, starting in 2025, should that come to pass, will try to do a lot of damage to the federal bureaucracy and administrative state, and that includes trying to dismantle the IRA along with a lot of other stuff. In many ways, it may be a slightly higher priority than some other bureaucratic attacks, but I basically think of it as part and parcel of that crusade against the federal bureaucracy, not as something that occupies their attention especially. Yeah.
So another thing that came out of COP, I think, was a bunch of countries like one saying that they want to triple their nuclear energy. And a lot of people involved in the nuclear kind of world are very skeptical that this will actually happen, but especially because it's difficult. There are a lot of countries who want to limit their nuclear, so who want a lot of it. But I guess, what kind of role do you see nuclear energy playing in energy transition, both in the United States and just kind of globally?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that we've lived through pretty rapidly a cultural shift around nuclear among environmentalists and climate people, where even 5 years ago, it was still quite contentious to say that nuclear should be considered a green energy source, and to talk about it as part of the solution. And we've really, really moved on that, so that it's now quite conventional to talk about it. The only question is at what scale, The basic problem for nuclear right now is just that it's so expensive. It's really expensive in the US. It's quite expensive in Europe, but it's basically expensive everywhere in the world. And so a lot of people who are pro-nuclear in the US will say, we just need to get our arms around the regulation and reform some of the oversight. There's basically nobody in the world that's been able to make nuclear economic for a very long time. And I'm a little bit skeptical that we'll be able to figure out a way to do it on meaningful timelines. That's not to say that we shouldn't be building some of it. We certainly shouldn't be turning off the nuclear power that's running today. It's been a mistake, and it's set us back that we've turned off a number of nuclear power plants in recent years. But the question of whether the market will produce a nuclear baseload of power, I think it's probably quite unlikely. Now, pulling back from that, the question of how much do we need nuclear or something like it to make up, to fill out the basic, at the moment we think wind and solar can probably provide, depending on who you ask or what analysis you trust, somewhere between 60 and 80% of our electricity needs in this country. On top of that, there's some intermittency issues. There are times recently in Texas where there's been no wind and no solar, and if we were totally dependent on renewable energies, right now in Texas we'd be screwed. So conventionally, people have thought, okay, how do we fill out that gap and how do we stabilize the intermittency issues? And nuclear was one solution to that. Other solutions are natural gas, presumably outfitted with some carbon capture, and maybe even in some cases, in some really limited capacity, like coal or oil. But almost as impressive, and in certain ways more impressive than the cost declines in renewables, has been progress in battery technology and storage technology in recent years. And those are a little bit later coming. Like we didn't really, the solar and wind revolutions that started like 15 years ago have really only started in batteries in the last 5 years. But we've seen an incredible expansion of American battery technology capacity to this point, and a lot of investment and exploration of ways in which the grid itself can be made into an energy storage system. There is also a lot of new interest and enthusiasm about hydropower, geothermal, and how these might be used effectively as storage, energy storage systems, or base power systems that could, solve the final 20% problem and the intermittency problem. Exactly what mix of those more stable sources we end up with, I honestly don't know, and I don't think it's easy to project. Most of them are cheaper than nuclear. Most of them also take up more space and land and are demanding in other ways than just cost. But my guess, if I had to guess, is that we end up using more hydro, certainly more geothermal, and a lot more battery storage, and probably not that much more nuclear than we have today. But mostly that's a cost calculation, and from a systems perspective, nuclear is a quite appealing option. It's just a matter of what we feel comfortable budgeting for and who's going to pay for it. Because it's probably not going to be like consumers. It's probably going to have to be basically like the state.
I'm going to throw in just one thing along these lines, which is fusion energy, just from the physics perspective. I mean, we haven't talked about it, but there's been a lot of excitement about fusion energy and the National Ignition Facility, and this is a free source of, it's complete garbage. That's not going to happen on.
I thought you were expressing optimism. I was going to be like, I have a contrary view.
Yeah, no, it's not going to happen on any timescale that's relevant for anything, if ever. I mean, that's a strong statement, but certainly not on any.
I don't remember the exact numbers. Maybe you do, but they like really celebrated these 2 experiments they did where they got a little bit of net energy gain, but it was like. It was something like for every 100 units of energy they put into the system, they got like 1 out.
Yeah.
It was like the gains were so tiny given what they had to,
Yeah, and even that accounting does not account for the full energy they're putting in, which is it's just not a viable alternative. So it's just not part of the discussion at all, which is appropriate.
So I guess my prior in climate change is that it just isn't a big deal. And so for example, I think that when I look into the details, I just am not convinced that it's a big deal. So I think cost estimates, for example, from the Nordhaus study gave something like 6% of GDP. And I think that a lot of policies do a lot of harm. For example, things like biofuels raise global food prices, and things like the IRA are big protectionist things that are politically popular, that don't really do much to address climate change. So I guess what would you say to things like those details? How would you convince me climate change really is something that you should care about?
Well, the first thing I would say is that I think almost all economists, probably including Bill Nordhaus, would say that those estimates are not reflective of the true costs of climate change. I mean, when I've spoken to him about it, he said there are all of these nonlinearities and tipping point problems that we just simply can't model, and so I don't model them. There have been estimates of the current damage to global GDP right now that are close to 10% of global GDP is being cost. We're losing every year because of climate impacts. Those impacts are likely to grow. I don't believe that we're going to end up in a world where we're considerably poorer overall than we are today because of the impacts of climate change. I think that's quite unlikely. But I think the difference between, if you model out, slightly more pessimistic scenarios about warming and its impacts that suggest something like 20 to 30% of GDP, global GDP, could be lost. Imagine if we as a planet right now are 30% poorer than we are. That would not be good. and we'd prefer to have been on the path that we're on. And we'd prefer to be on a path from here where we're 30% richer. And those are the kinds of scenario pathways that we're talking about. On top of which the impacts are regionally distributed, in some cases even locally distributed, and simply measuring in economic terms already shows a huge hit to the equatorial parts of the planet, such that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in fact the vast majority of them, have been shown to have already lost something like 20 to 30% of their GDP because of climate impacts to date. And if we get to, say, 3 or 4 degrees of warming, it's expected that they may lose entirely the capacity to grow economically at all. Now, anytime you're talking about modeling of that kind, it's complex and there's a huge amount of assumptions built into it. And really you're kind of like, you're saying more about your model than you are about the thing that you're trying to model. But I would say the same thing about the optimistic models that say that the ultimate economic impacts are not going to be very large. And when I think about all of the things that we know climate change is doing already, creating much more intense wildfires, much more intense heat waves. I mean, last summer in England, just in England, 60,000 people died because of heat. So technically, in the U.S., we have what's called we have a price of life. As a government, we value a human life at between $7 and $10 million. So what is that? That's 60,000. That's $500 billion of cost right there in one summer in one country. We had lunch earlier with Michael Greenstone, whose estimate of the social cost of carbon implies $1 trillion burden produced simply by U.S. emissions every single year, which means the United States, through working of its everyday economy, is imposing $1 trillion in damages every year on the planet today. Now, the planet is a complex place. The world economy is a complex place. Maybe you don't notice that $1 trillion of damages. It's distributed. It's focused in places that have always been struggling economically, and now they're just not growing as fast as they would have otherwise. But you can quantify the damages. Almost all economists look at the Nordhaus modeling especially and think that it's naive for a number of reasons, but maybe most importantly, that it treats climate impacts as discrete annual events rather than ones that affect the rate of growth and therefore can compound over time. Basically, I think when we think about extreme billion-dollar disasters, extreme weather events, the wildfires I mentioned, the effect on conflict, which grows with heat, the effect on agricultural yields, which are all else being equal, down, for temperature, goes down the higher the temperature gets, on rainfall, on drought, and the famine that's produced. It's very hard to me to think about climate as something that doesn't affect the operation of the world. It feels to me it's not all determinative. Human response is really important, but that the challenge that it's throwing up in our faces is quite large. And one thing I would just point to on that point, under-discussed, under-studied to this point, but when I started researching climate change 5-6 years ago, one thing that many climate scientists would say to me was the part of the world that is most vulnerable to climate impacts and most likely to fall into some amount of disarray because of them is the Sahel in Africa. Since 2020, there have been 7 coups in the Sahel, successful coups. There have been something like 8 or 10 unsuccessful coups. Then we have a band across the continent in which every single country has fallen into political instability in the last 3 years. They are also all dealing with extreme weather, famine, drought, food shortages. Climate change is not the sole determinant of that political instability, of course, but it's what we would expect to see in a world in which weaker, more vulnerable countries are disrupted by extreme weather, and it's a quite worrying phenomenon and trend. And, up in the global north, we can look around and say, our lives are working relatively well. We're not necessarily seeing aggregate economic impacts. But, I was reporting in northern Canada this year in the Northern Territories, which is an area 5 times the size of California, and every single town in the territory but one had to be evacuated simultaneously from wildfire. You had 90%, more than 90% of the territory was like evacuating, many of them having to drive 25 hours to get to a safe harbor destination through burning forest. That's happening right now in 2023. What's the economic cost of that? You know, there are probably different ways to model it, but the human cost is significant even if it doesn't show up in the data. And when you look at many other impacts, public health, cognition, there's a direct effect of heat on economic productivity. You know, all of these add up. And while, you know, I don't think it's fair to say like the world's gonna end here. I think humans are gonna be around, we're gonna be in a lot of ways flourishing. It'll also be flourishing on a landscape that is really defined by climate transformation from where we are today. And whether we end up quite prosperous or relatively prosperous or not much more prosperous than we are today, I think has a lot to do with how we're gonna handle those challenges. So I would just, yeah, I mean, I think that's how I would see the question at least.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. I have a question about when like transitioning to renewable energy or sustainability in urban cities or any sort of like climate policies, what do you do as the balance which you strike in between private enterprise and state-led policies, whether those two things are connected or not, or which one might be better for any of these transformations that we need to implement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a political discourse that's grown up around climate change that really does express itself in like a dorm room kind of a way as like a fight between socialism and capitalism. And just as like a first observation, I would say we don't live in a world that is purely one or the other. We live in a mixed economy that is directed by the state in very significant ways. And whether the state is like unleashing private investment or making direct capital investment or clearing permitting for private actors to move, we're talking about navigating some mixed system regardless. You know, the way that the IRA was built was basically entirely through tax incentives to subsidize private action. That seems to be the path that the US is going down. I think it is likely to produce a lot more renewable energy, and I think it's been pretty effective and efficient. I think most people, you know, if you had taken someone aside in 2012 and said, here's what we're looking at and thinking we're going to see in 2030 in terms of wind and solar rollout, people would have been like, wow, that's really impressive. How'd you achieve that? And the answer would have been mostly private investment, shepherded and sort of like led along by state subsidies. But other places in the world have moved in different ways, and the most impressive renewable rollout in the world by far has been in China. They're basically adding as much renewable capacity every year as the rest of the world combined. And that's a very different system, in which there are also market factors at play in China, but it's much more directed, much more state-directed. So, you know, exactly what's efficient and effective, I think says a lot more about the particular political system in which you inhabit than like whether we're going to turn the U.S. a little bit more towards, you know, state action or a little bit more towards private enterprise. But at the very least, I would say that the world that we have all lived in for a very long time in the U.S. has, up until very recently, proved inadequate to the task, and that a new era of somewhat more aggressive state action has opened up a whole new horizon of renewable energy possibilities. So, you know, I wish we were doing more. I think it's almost certain to be in the US and across most of Europe to be mostly private money led by, you know, public policy. But other mixes are in theory possible too.
Hi, this is more of, I guess, a political question, but given that the United States operates on the principle that a threat to democracy anywhere democracy everywhere. And seeing what's happening in South Africa, do you think the United States has a responsibility almost to intervene in climate change risk policy worldwide?
What do you mean by intervene? What do you have in mind?
I don't know, influence climate change risk policy in any form.
Well, you know, the U.S., I mean, is engaged in a lot of climate diplomacy, so there's a lot that is being done already. You know, the question is, how heavy-handed do you want us to be? How much money are we willing to spend to help other people? You know, what do we want to prioritize? I think absolutely the United States has a much greater responsibility for the climate fate of the world than almost anyone in power in America is willing to publicly acknowledge. And I think that taking practical politics entirely out of it, from a purely moral point of view, we should be embarrassed at how indifferent we've been on the world stage to the consequences of our actions. I mentioned a few minutes ago, totally credible calculations, including those done by Biden's EPA, suggest that the US is doing $1 trillion of damage every year to the world. We just came back from a COP where we told the newly established Loss and Damage Fund that we would commit $17 million. We owe $1 trillion a year, and we say, we'll pay you $17 million. That's like, you know, there are probably a couple guys on the Bulls who are making more money than that this year. It is a pitiful response. And ultimately, I think politically damaging in the sense that, like, you know, if you don't want people to talk about your climate guilt, maybe you make them an offer that they want to take as opposed to one that they can laugh at. Like, maybe you want to tell them, we're going to give you, you know, $100 billion or something, whatever it is. Like, if we're embarrassing them, you know, if we're insulting them with our offer, they're much more likely to say, you know, you guys are responsible for about a quarter of the problem here. No, that's like, you know, more on the kind of diplomacy and sort of allyship, support, philanthropy side of the equation. There's also a hard climate geopolitics, which basically no one has really begun to play in earnest, but which may become a bigger part of our world in the decades ahead. Some of the energy debates around Russia and Russian gas, some of what's going on with Iran and China involves energy issues, but I think we haven't yet gotten to a point where geopolitics is dominated by energy conflicts and climate, so much is just sort of affected by it. And I hope that we don't get to a place where we're like, basically being the world's cop on climate, in the way that we've been the world's cop on other things in the past, mostly because our hypocrisy is much greater on climate change even than it was on like human rights and that kind of stuff. But we'll see. I think the geopolitics of the transition and the geopolitics of climate change generally are very much uncertain. And it seems for this time being quite likely that we're going to end up in a situation where, to some extent the US and Europe is sort of aligned in basic agreement about the shape of the necessary path. And there are other alliances elsewhere in the world that have different ideas, and exactly how we negotiate that balance of power, it's a challenge. I don't know what's going to happen exactly. Anyway, I don't know. How about you?
So one of the reasons I and lots of my friends kind of struggle to think about these issues is because it makes us really miserable. It's really depressing to kind of come face to face with how screwed our situation seems to be. And so my question for you would be a slightly more personal one. As someone who's built a large part of your career, thinking, speaking, and writing about these big existential threats, how do you, I guess, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally sort of cope with that? while not minimizing the gravity of the issues. Do you think there is a way to do that?
I think everybody wrestles with this stuff in their own way. I mean, I think some of it is that I come to this as a journalist. You can call journalists sociopaths in the way that they see stories as opposed to suffering. Like, that's probably part of my own coping mechanism. But I also see a lot of majesty and grandeur in the story. It's kind of amazing to me in a kind of stoner awe way to think about the transformation of the planet unfolding on a human timescale. To think about the natural world that I knew as a child being fundamentally different than the one that my grandchildren might know. And I see a lot of reason for hope and enthusiasm, not just in terms of like, oh, the renewable rollout is going great, but in terms of the engagement and response of particularly young people. And, I finished my book in the fall of 2018, which is now about 5 years ago, a little more than 5 years ago. I finished the manuscript of my book in like September of 2018. And I had not heard of Greta Thunberg. Nobody had. She had just started striking outside of Parliament. She was a lonely, friendless 15-year-old sitting there by herself with a sign. Now she's enough an icon of a global political movement that her star turn is already in the past. Like, that's how much has happened in 5 years because of what she started doing on her own. And what it unleashed was a global political awakening among the world's youth about climate change. And that was, in certain ways, even more impressive than what she did, because it was often led by the most disempowered people anywhere in the world. We're talking about, queer ethnic minorities in non-democratic countries under the age of 18 who looked at the scale of the problem, felt many of the same things that you or I might feel about how difficult it would be to achieve change, and refused to accept the terms of that debate, and instead made a place for themselves at the table of global politics and discourse. And as a result, had their voices heard and had their voices echo up to the highest levels of power. And in so doing, kind of like changed the shape of the future of the planet. Got enough politicians feeling guilty and shamed to meaningfully change the course of their country's emissions trajectories, which collectively have meaningfully changed the course of the world's climate trajectories. So, it feels large and overwhelming and intimidating. And of course it is. It's a global system that is not just energy, and it's not just transportation, it's not just industry, it's not just agriculture, it's not just infrastructure, it's all that shit at once. And the people who have their hands on the levers of power directing those futures seem very distant. But it's important to remember just how much change has occurred in a very short time, because people who felt very distant from power insisted on being heard anyway. And I think that should, on some level, it should make us all feel ashamed that we're not doing that too, to the extent that we are. But it's also a reminder that history is still being written. The future is certainly still being written. And we are all the collective authors of this story, and we should do our part to help write a slightly better one as opposed to a slightly worse one. Now that's one answer. It's political activism and engagement in the future can change. But another is that, it's also useful to keep some of these threats in context. And this is a little bit connects to what the guy who over there was sitting was talking about when he was talking about this not being such a big deal. There are ways of talking about even pretty extreme climate change that can contextualize it and make it feel much less threatening. 10 million people a year are dying of air pollution right now. Almost certainly, we're never going to see that much climate death in any of our lifetimes. So there's more people dying from air pollution right now than ever we will see in a given year from climate change. We've normalized that. We've taken it for granted. It's an ugly moral fact of our present day. It should shame us all that we have looked away from it, but it also tells us that we navigate our lives mostly normally in the context of all that death and suffering. And presumably we'll find ways to do that in a world deformed and defined by climate change too. It will be a moral indictment of us that we will do that, but we will do it nevertheless, you know. We will look around at a world of 2 or 2.5 degrees of warming, and probably most of the time we'll just describe it and think of it as normal. There will be more suffering. When we quantify it, the suffering will be quite large. And because it was unnecessary, it'll be an indictment of our indifference and how slowly we moved. But human life will still go on. People will still have children, people will still have dreams, like all that stuff, which we imagine when we imagine the apocalyptic impacts will be snuffed out, are almost certain not to be snuffed out. They'll just be redirected and shaped around a very different looking world that is in many ways harsher for humans, but which invariably will find some ways to navigate to make us feel still fully human. Yeah.
I just want to ask about.
Sorry, I didn't mean to. I thought you were. Do you want to? Yeah.
I just want to ask about more generally about what the world after climate change would look like. So we talked a lot about like mitigating the climate change, you know, to cut emitting CO2 to try to achieve net zero. But what would the climate to adapt to some of its impacts? What would those adaptations look like in your imagination?
Well, you know, they run the gamut because the impacts are so diverse. So, you know, to take extreme heat, presumably a city like Chicago would have to be outfitted with considerably more heat-resistant infrastructure. Maybe much of the concrete would have to be replaced. Many of the buildings would have to be retrofitted. We'd have to make sure that there was a lot more air conditioning. We'd have to, you know, have whatever bus stops that sprayed mist on people and that kind of thing. You know, in other parts of the world, installing that kind of infrastructure is a much, much bigger deal than it seems here. You know, if you're talking about India, you're talking about a country in which like fewer than 1% of Indians have air conditioning. So we're not just talking about like making sure that, you know, a few more shelters and a few more apartment buildings have cooling technology. We're really talking about making a giant technological and economic leap up to the ability to cool. Over longer timescales, we're talking about protecting the world's coastlines, presumably by building coastal defenses, flood defenses. In New York, we're already talking about building a seawall that will enclose New York Harbor. That would probably cost $100 billion. That's just one city. And you know, there are many cities in the world that are as vulnerable or more vulnerable than New York. Probably that also means that in some places we'll calculate that it's not worth it to save those places, and instead we'll have people starting to move away. One of the reasons why New York is able to afford a $100 billion seawall is because the real estate is so valuable and nobody wants to lose it. There's also, you know, there are agricultural adaptations to allow crops to be grown under different conditions, under drought conditions, under higher temperatures. In some cases, we have crops already that we think can do that. We've tested them in labs, but they've proven hard to roll out, you know, especially in the parts of the world that kind of need the help most. So there's a kind of a political dimension to that, a cultural dimension to that adaptation too, not just technological. What else did I mention? There's flooding, heat, you know, extreme weather. In certain ways, there's not all that much that we can do except to build our infrastructure in a way that protects us better. We already are pretty good at forecasting and early warning systems, especially in the rich parts of the world, but increasingly in the poor parts of the world. We have, you know, if you look at what damage a tropical cyclone would have done in, you know, Bangladesh 50 years ago compared to what it does now, it's like, you know, we literally had cyclones that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and now they kill hundreds of people. And that's like just a completely different category of damage because of early warning systems. They're not present everywhere in the world, but presumably in a world defined much more by extreme weather, we'll have more early warning systems. But you know, in some cases, we're still just going to be dealing with these impacts directly. So this year in Acapulco, there was a storm that went from a relatively inconspicuous kind of quotidian tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in less than 24 hours, which means like that's just not enough time to prepare. Like you can't get you can't get enough sandbags, you can't get people to evacuate. It's not a place where people have underground bunkers, so they couldn't even shelter underground. It was just absolutely devastated. And we're likely to see a lot more kind of crazy, weird, freakish weather events like that, or like the fires across Canada or in Hawaii, where out of nowhere you go from a single spark to an urban firestorm spreading through densely settled places. Now, taking all that together, I think, we're not likely to look back on a world of 2 degrees or 2.5 degrees and think that it's, pushed us back till, into prehistory. But we're also going to be dealing with much, much larger and more intense impacts and disruptions than we have in our lives to this point, and which we have been raised to expect. And so exactly what that, exactly how we think about that model, the model of adaptation, the model of, human experience in that context is, I think, TBD. But, in most cases, you can say there are things in theory that we can do. The problem is there have been things in theory that we could do for a very long time, and we haven't done many of them yet. In fact, in many parts of the world, people are moving towards climate risk, not away from it. We're still building infrastructure that's not resistant to heat at the right levels. We're still building airplanes whose wings droop in the heat and that kind of thing. So maybe a new generation of understanding and awareness in climate science will bring about a more universal design impulse and integrating climate considerations into more building. I'm sure that it will to some extent, but to what extent it does and to what extent we just decide we're going to wing it and fly into that climate future with what we got, we'll see.
I just wanted to ask about the political downstream effects you were talking about earlier of climate change. And in a world where you have democratic systems across the global north, the US, but especially in Europe, that are already buckling under the strain of being unable or unwilling to accept increased immigration from these countries, when you're going to have vastly increased climate-based migration from some of the fastest growing regions of the world. In Australia, you have Papua New Guineans, and in Europe, you have sub-Saharan Africans. What do you think are the dangers for democratic systems who already have these kind of nativist, anti-immigrant backlash?
I mean, that's the danger, right? I think, there are a lot of people who worry about a real intensification of nativism and sort of border crises, even from where we are today. And who worry really about a pretty militant, xenophobic, not just cultural response to immigration pressures, but militaristic, diplomatic response. And I think it's possible. In the US, it's been really instructive, right? We had, the migration boom that Trump was elected in part to respond to was powered in part from climate pressure. He responded to it in quite kind of proudly brutal ways. Joe Biden was elected in certain ways to undo some of that damage after a few years of, liberals rallying in support of the rights of migrants and against the brutality of Trump's border policies. And yet the border policy that is still alive in the US is pretty similar to Trump's. It's not that different. We're still doing family separation at the border. Like we stopped talking about it because the president's a Democrat, but we're still doing it. And they're now talking about forging a border compromise that's, pretty right-wing by the standards of like the 90s or the 2000s. And that would be a Biden accomplishment. That would, so, I think that we are drifting in that direction, which is the wrong direction from my perspective. Whether our societies can accommodate the level of migration that climate change might produce is an open question. And I would like to see much more openness at the political, cultural, and individual level to migration than we've seen in almost any rich country in the world. But if you take seriously some of these migration projections where we might see hundreds of millions of migrants by 2050, that's a lot of people. And one can hope. There is social science suggesting that resistance to migration is greatest when the numbers are actually relatively small. And once you get past a certain point, society tends to be a little bit more accommodating and welcoming. Maybe that's kind of hopeful, wishful thinking. But the UN's immigration office says that it's possible that we could have 1 billion climate migrants. And I think that's a kind of a foolish and too high estimate. But that's as many people as live today in North America and South America combined. And the UN says that it's possible that many people could be fleeing their countries as soon as 2050. And certainly that we should expect 200 million by 2050. That is a large number of people. And I don't think that we are prepared. I don't think that it would be easy, even if we were extremely excited to welcome those people. I don't think it would be so easy to do it. And given how not that in that place we are, I think it's going to be even harder. You do see in Europe already, the whole continent's politics have been transformed by nativism. And, I don't know where that leads. It could be some pretty dark places. And there, people talk about avocado politics. It's green on the inside, brown on the outside. It's basically like a climate fascism. And is that possible everywhere? No, I think it's probably not going to happen everywhere. But you listen to the immigration rhetoric already of a lot of European leaders. It sounds pretty harsh, and it is definitely informed by a sense of climate pressure. So,
And with tiny numbers compared to where we're headed.
yeah.
So this is kind of a follow-on to that. I mean, you describe all this, events, the fires, and of course, recently there's certainly been built around, amplifying, the frequency, the rarity, the improbability, of extreme weather events and their consequences, and kind of working out, future consequences. But, I wasn't really even aware at all about the Canadian fires and about, and I know people in California, kind of I grew up there in some kind of, it's just if you look globally, for example, I think, I remember The Economist in 2015 highlighted the massive gap in empathy, for example, between a very similar Beirut and Paris, kind of terrorist event. And one of the things I've looked at is, based on very particular exposures, you either your expectations are violated because, but most often you get reinforced views of the world, and most of these stories that you're describing, a sense of improbable change is not penetrated or hasn't penetrated. I'm not saying it. So that, maybe someone who was in one of these crises or is in places which we're currently having. So how does one think about the cascade of events that's going to make people aware? Like where are the flow of migrants going to come? Where are the, such that, like certain places, certain countries become much more aware, much more sensitive to the effects of climate change than others? Like, how do you, and is that part of a broader realization? I mean, do you think that people are going to connect? So, for example, Daniel and I during the break were talking about, Chicago. So 7.7 million Venezuelan migrants have left. About 20,000 in Chicago. You can feel them in Chicago. I mean, like I've been here for 20 years. You've never seen homelessness like you've seen this year. It just hasn't happened before. And I don't know.
Including a community here in Hyde Park, just up the street.
Yeah, we're running an event on Saturday. It's just there are neighborhood there. And maybe there's a climate component. There's lots of other components.
Yeah.
Obviously, to these things, but what's the cascade by which these events, they get amplified obviously with storytelling, but I think it's not enough, or it's not, it becomes much more real when it's a relative, when it's someone in a seemingly comparable place, or when it's in your neighborhood. So what does that cascade of events and realizations look like in the years to come?
Well, my worry is that the cascades happen, but the realization doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's...
So people don't connect the migration to climate change, or they just see them as an independent, decoupled threat.
Yeah, you mentioned California and the fire, so I did a story about, I'm putting aside the question of migration for a second, but I did a story about California fires in 2019. I talked to Eric Garcetti, who was the mayor of LA at the time, and he was 46 at the time or something. The year he was born, 40,000 acres burned in California. The year he was elected mayor in 2013, it was 400,000, so it was a tenfold increase. The year he was re-elected, 2018, it was 1.2 million, so it was a tripling. And then the year before we were speaking, we were speaking in 2019, it was 2018, it had been 1.89 million, so it was a 50% increase in a single year. The year after we spoke, it was 4.2 million. So we're talking about going from 40,000 acres to 4.2 million in the space of a middle-aged person's lifetime. And that is an absolutely astonishing upward curve. And yet, everybody I talked to in California said, we've always had fire. And I said, yeah, you did. But I read Joan Didion, and she was talking about 1,000 acres. She was talking about 5,000 acres. She wasn't talking about this scale of fire. It's of a totally different category, 10 times more, 100 times more. And they said, you guys had Sandy, right? And I was like, true. True. I met a woman in Malibu who lived through 9 fires. 9 fires. And she talked about climate change, and she talked about wildfire risk. She was still living in Malibu. And that I think is at least to the story that we've observed to this point, is normalization above all. When we think about the global story, I think it's even uglier. My personal feeling is not that rich Westerners are unmoved by the climate suffering of people living elsewhere in the world. It's that they're gratified by it. They see it as a confirmation of their superiority and their privilege, and they aren't unhappy about it. They look at climate suffering in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and they think, if they think about it as climate at all, they think this is the natural order of things, and I'm on top. That's the basic psychological coping mechanism. And that even if we suffer a little bit, we know that there are going to be people who are suffering a lot more, and that's comforting. Now, whether migration can change some of that dynamic and make us look head on and really stare straight in the face of what we've done and the changes that we've unleashed on the world. You know, I think it's likelier it works in the other direction. I think it's likelier that we respond to those pressures and those people arriving with ugliness. I don't see in the recent period of climate-powered migration, I don't see signs of really any country that's doing great. You know, the US is taking many more people than it used to, but it's also taking many more people than almost any of its citizens want. And you see around the world much more of a, you know, the question of us versus them, who's inside the fence and who's outside the fence, is just a more central way to the way that we think about and talk about geopolitics. More people talk in zero-sum terms these days. I don't think that's just climate change, but I think climate change is playing a role. I think perceptions of diminishing abundance and increasing scarcity are shaping the way that we think about the transactional nature of trade and politics. And it seems to me like things are, in general, moving more in that direction rather than the other direction. And even when there is a great outpouring of empathy for a particular climate disaster or climate event, it dissipates so quickly. I mean, the fire in Lahaina in Maui, people really cared for like a week. It was the deadliest American fire in a century. Hundreds of people died. A town was destroyed. You know, it is not, like how many Americans donated to the Red Cross relief or whatever, like when Christmas season came around this year to, you know, wildfire relief in Maui? I don't think many. And that's like us. It's like our country. It's a place many Americans have like been to, or at least like thought a lot about. Hawaii. It was a terrifying picture of a climate disaster in the sense of, you know, a grass fire turning into an urban firestorm in the space of a few minutes and destroying a whole town in the space of an hour. So if you imagine yourself, I mean, people had to jump into the ocean to avoid the fire from burning them, and the fires leapt over them onto the boats that were floating in the harbor, and the boats burned in the harbor while the citizens of Lahaina were sitting there. That is like horror movie shit. And it didn't really move the needle. I think that, you know, people respond to and get more worried about climate over time from the assault of these images. I think a lot of people responded to the Blade Runner images of California in 2020. I think a lot of people were really freaked out by the air in New York. But I think ultimately, whether we engineer a political response that's more generous towards the people who are suffering even more than us, I don't know that that's a safe bet. I think it's much likelier that we respond in the other direction. And it's a shame because I would like to think.
But you tell these stories, right? And presumably you do it because you want to.
Well, you know, it's funny. It's funny. I whenever I'm in environments like this, especially on college campuses, you know, in the class we were in today, it's like everybody's asking practical questions, like what can we do? Should we be thinking about this solution or that solution? How should I think about my own individual life? It's all this very practical, like how can I change the story questions. And even you're asking about my work and you're saying like, but you tell these stories, therefore you must think there's some potential in them. I guess on some level I do, but I also think my main job is just to document what's going on.
And why? Why don't?
Because human suffering and experience is important, just on its own. Like, I think about this all the time with the pandemic. It's like, I would send text messages to friends, and I was like, holy shit, have you seen this? What's going, you know, the death rates are here in the state. And they would say, what should we do? You think we should do mask mandates? I was like, I'm not making a policy point. I'm just saying people are dying. And if people are dying, we should pay attention. Like, we are bearing witness. That's part of what we do here. and thinking about, I mean, personally, I think a lot about our own complicity as Americans, the responsibility we have as the world's largest historical emitter by far, the way in which we are blinding ourselves to that. There's a sociological question about exactly how we process that information, and that's all interesting. But I don't fundamentally think that the job of storytelling is about changing the world. I think that it's about documenting the one that we're living in and getting the history right, which is something also that I thought a lot about with the pandemic. You know, we live through this world historical event where, like, how can we possibly be misremembering it so quickly? But we are. And, you know, I do think that there is potential for awakening and increased empathy. I do think that I don't want to totally write it off. And I do think that, you know, sharing the stories and can help. But I don't think that's the main job of the story, of a journalist, or an intellectual or whatever. And ultimately, I think that the tragedy is that climate change should teach us about our shared vulnerabilities and our shared humanity. And because we're all on this one planet together, it's one climate system. Everyone putting carbon up into the atmosphere anywhere is affecting the lives of everyone everywhere. It's all stitched together. But I think what we've seen so far is that we respond to that challenge, not by being called to have a more universal sense of responsibility and shared humanity, but something in which we draw our circles of empathy narrower and narrower.